welcome to the first keynote and the opening keynote of our final conference of 2024. And this conference theme is looking at pantheism. And to start us off, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Lina Langby from the Department of Theology at Uppsala University in Sweden. Dr. Langby is a Doctor of Philosophy and Religion, and her research concerns conceptions of God, particularly panentheism and pantheism, and the consequences of different sorts of God talk. She's the author of God and the World, and has several articles and anthology chapters on pantheism, panentheism, and relational theology. And her most recent articles explore panpsychism and the rights of nature. But today she's going to talk to us about panentheism, classical theism, and special divine action. So a really good place to start, I think, hopefully getting some terminology sorted out and setting us off on the right path. So delighted to have you, Lina, and over to you when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Pleased to be here. I'm gonna share my screen. Yes, Panentheism, Classical Theism, and Special Divine Action is the title of my presentation. So Arthur Peacocke and the theologian and philosopher Philip Clayton defend Panentheism as the best option when relating science and religion. Peacocke and Clayton, they argue that Panentheism offers an understanding of how God causally acts in the natural world in ways that do not contradict the natural sciences. So it is with this question that I engage, and I reconstruct their positions into what I call the emergence argument for panentheism. And I will compare how well panentheism fits with natural science contrasted with classical theism. So why do Peacocke and Clayton and others believe that panentheism is more compatible with science than, in this case, classical theism? Well, this brings us to the emergence argument. So the emergence argument for panentheism states that special divine action, and I will come back to that, as understood in panentheism, is more coherent with natural science than classical theism is. But what reasons are there to think this? To answer that, we must first know what the potential problem with special divine action is. So in natural science, such as physics, neuroscience, chemistry, and so on, you conduct all observations and formulate all theories based on the causal closure principle. And this principle says that the universe is a closed system. All effects have their cause within the closed system that is the universe. A physicalist perspective on the causal closure principle claims that all physical effects have necessary and sufficient physical causes, and that those causes can be found within the physical universe. As will become apparent, a non-reductive physicalist perspective on the causal closure principle claims that all effects have their cause within the universe, but leaves open the possibility of mental causes. Natural sciences should never invoke supernatural explanations to describe natural processes. This is a principle of methodological naturalism, which says nothing about ontology. Only metaphysical naturalism makes ontological claims. However, methodological naturalism works as if no gods or spirits or other supernatural entities have causal effects in the natural world. So in other words, methodologically, natural science assumes that no supernatural entities, such as gods or spirits or whatever, have any causal influence, and that physical effects have purely physical causes. In the debate about divine action as compatible or incompatible with science, the relevant action is what is called special or sometimes particular divine action. So when theists affirm God as creator and sustainer of the world, God acts as the constant sustaining cause. That kind of divine action is called general divine action. So God's general action in this sense never ceases, because then the world would cease to exist. So both classical theists and panentheists tend to agree that God constantly sustains the world in its existence in this sense. The question related to science is whether God can be thought to act or intervene in the world by means of special or particular divine action. Such divine action would, for example, temporarily change or interfere with otherwise law-governed and causally closed universe as described by the sciences. If the world is a unified network of cause and effect, then a spiritual and purely non-physical God cannot work in it other than by means of supernatural intervention. Now, classical theism holds God to be ontologically independent and as a transcendent pure spirit. If such a God interacted with the world through special divine action, it would, from the perspective of the causal closure of the universe, be by means of supernatural intervention. So on that account, classical theism is thought, at least according to this argument, to be inconsistent with science. But are there reasons to think that panentheism would be more consistent with science? Does not panentheism also violate the causal closure principle? Peacocke writes that God acts in the world analogously to how a person is present to all the parts of the body. God acts in, with, and under the natural processes. For this reason, he argues that panentheism is more compatible with the natural sciences than classical theism, because if God acts by affecting the natural world, for example, on the quantum level, then we can explain divine action without resorting to supernatural explanations. Of course, the classical theistic God could also affect the world on a quantum level. However, that interference would be a supernatural intervention because the classical theistic God is an ontologically independent, distinct, wholly spiritual, and transcendent being. God is since the world, according to panentheism, is in God or part of God, there is no qualitative or ontological difference between a divine action or natural action. To make sense of this panentheistic claim, panentheists such as Peacocke and Clayton often use the analogy of how the mind affects the physical body to argue that in panentheism, God can act directly in the physical world. In this panentheistic analogy, God is the mind that causally affects the physical body, the world in the analogy. But for this analogy to be scientifically acceptable, there must be some reasons to think that the mind actually can work causally on the physical body. In other words, the causal influence of the mind can not only be an epiphenomenon that is reducible to merely physical neurons. Only if there are reasons to think that non-physical entities, such as minds, can have causal efficiency in the physical world, do we have reason to think that this panentheistic analogy works sort of as a reason for the compatibility of science and panentheism. So are there reasons to think that non-physical entities can have causal efficiency in the physical world? This brings us to emergence theory. And emergence theory, as described by Philip Clayton, claims that the nature of the world is such that it produces, and perhaps must produce, continually more complex realities in a process of ongoing creativity. Furthermore, emergence theory states that physical objects and phenomena such as atoms and electrons can arrange themselves to produce new and complex properties that are more than their constitutive parts. So consciousness, self-consciousness, and the minds would be examples of this. Clayton describes emergence theory as containing four parts. So the first is inwardly monism. And a panentheist named Oliver Lee, he clarifies that emergence theory is neutral with respect to whether or not matter is the basis of all phenomena. 2, property emergence. 3, irreducibility of the emergence. And 4, downward or top-down causation. So first, both Clayton and Peacocke claim that reality is composed of one type of stuff, but this stuff cannot be reduced to merely physical parts. They reject reductive physicalism. Mind or spirit can emerge from physical matter, but cannot be reduced to it. The second feature states that novel properties and phenomena emerge from lower level physical aggregates. The lower level phenomena cannot reduce or predict these new complex properties. And as will become apparent, the fourth feature here separates what is called weak emergence from strong emergence. And weak emergence theory states that new emergent properties or phenomena are unexpected or unpredictable, but in principle, even if they're unexpected, in principle they could be deduced from the physical laws alone. But strong emergence theory states that the emergent properties or phenomena are physically non-reductive and causally efficacious, so that the whole causally affects its parts. So this is called the top-down or downward causation. The causal impact of the whole on its parts is not even deducible in principle in strong emergence theory. Reductive physicalism assumes that all causes are physical, but some events seems to indicate the emergence of something non-reductive. So according to non-reductionists, there are cases in which a theory of a physicalist bottom-up causation is insufficient. Instead, a top-down explanation appears to be needed. So this is what strong emergence states. A science based on reductive physicalism cannot explain the mind's causal effect on the body without reducing this causality to an epiphenomenon. When there is top-down causation, something new has emerged from the low-level component that cannot be explained by mere knowledge of the physical components. The theoretical physicist and theologian John Polkinghorne supports a non-reductive description of the natural world by strong emergence theory, and he writes, and I have a quote, "The clockwork universe is dead. The future is not just the tautologist's spelling out of what was already present in the past. Physics shows an openness to new possibility at all levels, from the microscopic where quantum theory is important, to the macroscopic, where it's not. In that sense, physics describes a world of which we can conceive ourselves as being inhabitants. If Polkinghorne, Peacocke, and Clayton are correct, the universe is not a deterministic and physically reductive system. Complex systems, such as a seeing eye, indicate a bottom-up causation. The physical is constituted to result in the eye sort of being able to see. However, phenomena such as the mind's influence on the body cannot be explained with a bottom-up causation. If the mind actually can affect the physical body, for example, a mental intention to lift the arm, which causes the physical brain to cause the muscles in the arm to move, indicates an emergent top-down causation. This implies that explanations both in natural science and in theology can take the form of downward causation, or whole part influence, as Peacocke preferred to call it. Peacocke proposes that theists should conceptualize God and God's special action in the world in terms of this whole part influence. The world exists and behaves in ways that are only explainable by the whole system, which is God. This model works for panentheists, such as Peacocke, but not for classical theists, since they cannot think of God and the world as a joint system. So we can now see how emergence theory relates to panentheism. Presuming the reality of strongly emergent phenomena, that, for example, minds are as real as the neurons and physical structures from which they possibly emerge, God, as the omnipotent yet immanent mind, can be thought to act in the world by influencing it in a non-intervening or non-supernatural way. Since panentheism holds the world to be in God and vice versa, the divine actions would not come from the outside, as supposedly would be the case in classical theism. The panentheistic emergence argument thus states that special divine action, from the perspective of panentheism, would not violate the causal closure of the universe. Peacocke's words serve to summarize the emergence argument. He says, on this model of God's relation to the world as a whole, the total world system is seen as in God, who, uniquely, is present to it as a whole, as well as to its individual component entities. If God interacts with the world at this supervenient level of totality, then he could be causatively effective in a top-down manner without abrogating the laws and regularities and the unpredictabilities we've noted that operate at the myriad sub-levels of existence that constitute that world. According to Peacocke, God's intervention in the world is naturalistic, since all events in the world are within the laws of physics. However, they also express God's intention, just as the natural world contains systems that cannot be explained except in terms of top-down causation. This is perhaps to stretch the meaning of the word naturalistic, because many would argue that God is not natural, but indeed supernatural. But then again, that is the panentheistic point, that there is no clear distinction between God and the world, if the world is in God or part of God's being. So in summary, the panentheistic emergence argument states that panentheists can understand special divine action in the world in ways that coheres with natural science, rationally acceptable scientific explanations about causality must be in terms of natural explanations. In other words, supernatural causal explanations involving gods or spirits, angels, and so on are not acceptable. According to the critics, a classical theistic conception of God holds God's action to be supernatural intervention. According to classical theism, God is a wholly different and transcendent kind, distinct from the world, not part of the world. So God is not part of the world except in respects of God's voluntary omnipresence. So how can an ontologically transcendent, non-physical and wholly different kind of entity act causally in the world except through supernatural intervention? According to this panentheistic argument, it cannot. So panentheists often use the analogy of how the non-physical mind causally affects the physical body to show how the panentheistic God, seen as the world's omnipresent mind, can act causally from within the physical world, since the world is in God. According to this argument, such divine action would not be supernatural because a cause from within it's a cause from within the otherwise causally closed universe. Using the emergence argument, panentheists can argue that divine action is more coherent with natural science than classical theism is. So let's evaluate this a little closer. Classical theists would most likely object to this entire reasoning. The classical theistic approach to divine action relates intimately to the belief in God as the creator and sustainer of the world, which is the general divine action. Classical theists claim that God is necessarily involved in the world because the world cannot exist without God's constant sustaining activity. In the words of classical theist Brian Davies, talk about God as intervening has to presuppose that there is commonly a serious absence of God from created things. Yet if God is, in my sense, indeed the creator of all things, then he is never absent from any of them. A miracle, according to classical theists, is not a special divine interference with natural laws, because God is always immanently present as the upholder of the world's existence. A possible way of understanding miracles from a classical theistic perspective is to say that a miracle happens when only God acts as the cause, as opposed to when worldly causes are also involved. Edward Fieser, another classical theist, he explains this like this. For again, in the Thomistic view, God is not properly conceived of either on the model of one natural substance acting on others or as a God of the gaps, but only if he were conceived of in either of those ways could it make sense to blame him for failing to intervene to prevent harm, in the way that a human being governed by natural law might be blamed for failing to intervene to prevent harm from befalling another being. Classical theists can thus object to the claim that God intervenes in the act in creation in a supernatural way. God usually acts in the world by using secondary causes. God is always the a causal power, but not always the sole causal power at work. This is what is known as the double agency. Davies, he argues that the notion of intervening or not intervening suggests a deistic approach, such that God can choose not to be involved in the world. But classical theists reject the idea that God can pop in and out of the world, or that we can ever conceive of the world as being without the constant sustaining divine activity. In normal cases, God and objects or subjects in the world are the cause for what happens in the world. So a few words must be said about this classical theistic response. So first, panentheists also hold the world to be dependent on and sustained by God's general action. The world could not exist at all if it weren't for God's creative and sustaining action. So classical theists and panentheists agree on that. The issue is rather whether special divine action should be understood to be a break with the natural order or not. According to the classical theistic tradition, God is the first and ultimate cause for all other created causes, while God is not a created cause at all. God usually uses secondary created causes to act in the world, and those causes are empirically observable and or measurable. The empirical causes are causally real, although not of the same ontological level as God's primary sustaining cause. Ulf Jonsson, he's a Swedish theologian working within the Thomistic classical theistic tradition. He describes it as follows. God is causally active only as a transcendent primary cause and never as a created secondary cause. God is thereby never an inwardly natural explanation for anything, which entails that God is never the answer to any scientific question. The claim or assumption that God constantly acts as a sustaining cause for why anything actually exists in the first place is not a scientifically acceptable claim because it goes beyond what we can say given methodological naturalism. And as seen in this quote, God is never the answer to any scientific questions. Only secondary causes are empirical and therefore sort of scientifically available to us. Whether or not a divine primary cause lurks in the background is irrelevant from the perspective of methodological naturalism, since it says nothing about ontology, which is not to say that there cannot be a divine primary cause lurking in the background. Classical theism and its notion of secondary causality is thus consistent with natural science and methodological naturalism if God, as the primary cause, is left out of the empirical explanation. Even if God, in fact, is a constant cause for all effects, it isn't scientifically possible to say so, at least not as long as methodological naturalism is the fundamental principle of natural science. Both God and in an inworldly event can be the cause of an effect, but science can only point to the inwardly cause, and given Occam's razor, the non-scientific cause must be removed from the scientific explanation. However, even if classical theists say that God usually uses secondary causes when acting in the world, they also accept that God can act directly without secondary created causes. Classical theists also take purely divine causal power to be possible. We have the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, for example. Given that a miracle is an act caused by God alone without secondary empirical causes, explanations referring to such divine causation are obviously unacceptable from a methodological naturalist perspective. special divine action without secondary causes is possible from a classical theistic perspective. So it still seems to be the case that God's activity, at least when it's direct and without the use of secondary causes, would have to be conceptualized as divine interventions, even if the classical theists would argue that there cannot be any non-divine causes at all, since God always participates in creation and upholds its existence. So assuming for the moment that this is a problem, is panentheism a better conception of God from the standpoint of modern science when trying to explain how God acts in the world? And I have a quote from Polkinghorne, who refers to Peacocke. He says, Arthur Peacocke is right to say, there is no sense in which subatomic particles are to be graded as more real than, say, a bacterial cell or a human person, or even social facts. Every level of description is needed in our effort to do justice to the rich and varied process of the world, in its nature both flexible and reliable, including the category of divine providence. So there's no reason to think that strongly emergent phenomena, if real, would be sort of non-natural. If non-physical minds emerge from physical base parts, they would still be part of the causally closed system. The mental causality would be a top-down causality, but still within the law-governed natural world. So for the sake of argument, I'm assuming that strong emergence is real. So supervenience, irreducibility, and causal efficacy are necessary components in a strong emergence theory. According to supervenience theory, the mental exists because of the physical. In other words, it's dependent on the physical for coming into being in the first place. Non-reductionist theories, such as strong emergence theory, hold not only the proposition that the mental supervenes on the physical to be accurate, they also hold that the mental is irreducible to the physical, and that the mental has a causal power to influence both mental and physical properties. Given that the mental is supervenient on the physical, it is impossible for there to be a mental causation without a physical base cause. But what happens when the emergence of mind is taken as an analogy for how God interacts with the physical world? Well, it appears that God would be emergent from the physical. But this is something that neither Clayton nor Peacocke accepts or argues for. However, we do not need God to be emergent to use this analogy for how God acts within the natural world in a non-interventionist way. The point of the analogy is to show how mental causes can have a causal efficiency on physical entities within the natural world. If that's correct, God as a mental or spiritual entity would have no problem interacting with the physical world. Given panentheism, God is immanent in the world just as the world is immanent in God. There would be no break with natural laws, according to the argument. But is this right? What about the causal closure of the world? Would not the panentheistic God also be said to interfere with the causal closure principle? Thomas Tracy and some others have pointed out that the theory of the universe as a unified causally closed natural system is it's a metaphysical theory, not a scientifically verifiable and observable one. Others would even say that it's a metaphysical theory without any evidence at all to suggest its reasonableness. Science, therefore, according to Tracy, does not commit us to a view of the natural order that rules out objectively special divine action, even if that action constitutes an intervention. The principle of causal closure is not a scientific fact. It's a philosophical hypothesis, originally springing from a reductive physicalist worldview. As such, it should be regarded as a methodological assumption, but not as a scientific truth. Therefore, theistic theories of divine action that go against the ontological principle of causal closure are still compatible with science, since science is only committed to causal closure as a methodological tool, not an ontological fact or theory. Furthermore, the use of methodological naturalism when exploring and answering questions of cause and effect says nothing of whether such explanations are exhaustive. In fact, the openness of mental/spiritual causality beyond the scope of methodological naturalism suggests that any explanation that is based solely on methodological naturalism is likely to be partial and non-exhaustive. If causal closure is not taken as an ontological truth, then any theory of divine, mental, or spiritual influence on the physical world is, in principle, compatible with science. The reason is that a causally open system is open also to non-physical causal reasons, such as mental or spiritual influence. Panentheist Oliver Lee, he argues that even if causal closure is taken as an ontological fact, panentheism coheres with it. More specifically, panentheism is consistent with ontological causal closure as a non-reductive physicalist theory. This is because God's causal acts, given panentheism, are from within the causally closed world, not from without. According to Oliver Lee, panentheists therefore need not distinguish between divine non-natural causality and natural causality. Panentheism entails an ontological dualism in that God transcends the world in some sense. But panentheism does not necessarily entail inwardly dualism between mind and matter. Mind-matter dualism or mind-body monism are extension claims to panentheism and pantheism and classical theism as well. Panentheists do not claim that the line between the transcendent and the immanent aspects of God in the God-world relationship is a line above or beyond the world. So in the words of Catherine Keller, the line is smudged. So the smudged line is sort of within God rather than within or above the world. In line with how general divine action, God's constant sustaining activity, can never be distinguished from the world and its natural causes, neither can special divine action be in panentheism. Divine non-natural causality and natural causality cannot be distinguished in panentheism because they both work from within the a causally closed yet physically non-reductive system. There would be no way of discerning whether a cause is natural or divine, because we would not be able to discover scientifically the divine aspect of a cause in the world as if it were sort of add-on to the otherwise natural causes. But in order not to collapse this theory into pantheism, there must be some difference between divine natural and natural causality. But given the panentheistic God-world inclusion, this difference is still not grounds for calling the panentheistic divine action a break with natural laws. Okay, but again, can classical theists not also conceptualize God's action from within the world in some non-interventionist way? Yes, they can. Thomas Tracy mentions at least 4 ways in which divine action can be conceived of. I will focus on the 4th. He says that God's actions can be seen as directly determining the underdetermined or indeterministic aspects at the quantum level. So this suggestion is a form of direct divine action that nevertheless is non-intervening, in the sense that it's not a break with natural laws from the outside. So this suggestion appeals to the indeterminate states within quantum physics. So given quantum theory, we cannot determine in advance the outcome of events, but at best give a probabilistic answer. If Tracy is right, then theists can coherently combine scientific explanations with special divine action in the world. Even classical theists can coherently claim that God acts in the world, for example, by influencing it on the indeterministic quantum level. However, given that classical theism conceptualizes God as a wholly different, independent, absolutely transcendent, non-physical entity or being, such divine acts, even though they are within the world, must coherently still be conceived of as coming from without. However, if the universe is not a causally closed system, this isn't a problem. If the principle of causal closure is only a methodological and not an ontological commitment in science, there also appears to be coherent ways for classical theism, despite its stronger focus on divine transcendence, and despite God being a wholly different kind or substance than the world, consistently to combine special divine action with science. Both classical theism and panentheism are thus consistent with science on this account. Panentheism can be said to be more coherent with science than classical theism, only if ontological causal closure is taken into account. But given that the ontological causal closure principle is a contested philosophical theory with no scientific evidence in its favor, the fact that classical theism is inconsistent with it is not a weakness. So in conclusion, both classical theism and panentheism are consistent with the methodological naturalism that is the foundation of any scientific theory. Panentheism appears to be consistent both with the ontological and the methodological principle of causal closure. Classical theism is consistent only with the methodological principle. However, given the stronger ontological claim, given that the stronger ontological claim is not a scientific claim, it's a philosophical, metaphysical claim, it has no proper role to play in scientific theories and explanations. Classical theists must accept that their conception of God is not consistent with the ontological causal closure principle. But that's a small price to pay, since that does not affect whether their conception of God is incompatible with science. So limiting the focus here to the question of special divine action and natural science, theists have little or no reason to prefer panentheism to classical theism. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. A kind of silent virtual applause is going around the room. It's never quite the same, but the feeling is the same. So thank you ever so much for a really brilliant talk. And I think a really great place to start this conference, actually. I can't see any questions in the chat at the minute. I don't know if anyone's got any. Oh, look at that. Our questions have all, our hands are up. Okay, Luca, go for it. You managed to get in first. So Luca, over to you. You're on mute, Luca.
Do you hear me? Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Do you hear me?
We do.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Yeah. Very good. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. I just would like to hear an opinion about the role of incarnation within panentheism. I think you didn't mention this in the presentation, but it's surely the exemplar of the transcendence which merge with the immanence, given that God take human flesh, so touches the creation. What is your opinion on this concerning your project, your view of panentheism? Does it help? Do you see it? What's your view on that? I'm interested to hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'm very interested in that question. I think, yeah, I would really love to do more on the idea of the incarnation, both in panentheism but also Christian pantheism, because I think there are very interesting and possibly also problematic issues to deal with there. I have, to be honest, I haven't focused yet on the incarnation in relation to panentheism. I have stayed sort of a meta level above specific religions, dealing more with like the conception of God, which cannot be shared between different religions. But the issue for me that I would like to explore more is not so much related to science, perhaps, but more like Christian theology. What would if the world is already part of God, given panentheism, what new aspect happened in the incarnation, if given the idea that God had to become part of the world for some reason? But if God already was part of the world, why the incarnations? So I think that's a super interesting question. I have no answer yet, but I would love to think more about that.
Thanks, Lina. Andrew, you're next.
Thank you so much, Lina. Yeah, my question is building on Luca's. There are different kinds of panentheism, as I'm sure you know. You know that you have the process theology kind of panentheism, where God himself is dependent on the world and changes with his own creation. And then there's Arthur Peacocke's one, which is analogous to top-down causation of the mind. And then, as Luca said, there's this incarnational form where not just the historical incarnation of Jesus of Nazareth, but a cosmic Christ who's innermost to all things. And it strikes me that that one is more consistent with ontological naturalism, rather than God kind of reaching down, using the analogy of the mind, because that is much more in competition. You know, we human beings, when we think something, and it activates our motor neurons to go and do something, that becomes in competition with the natural world around us. So it becomes like 50% our action and 50% the reaction of some natural object. So by that analogy, God and the world are in competition, whereas if God is innermost to all things, there is no competition because he is fully determining. Of course, it raises other questions as to the nature of free will, especially in human beings. But I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, I'm fully aware that there are different versions of panentheism, and I don't know if you've heard, but I'm very fond of the deep incarnation view, which is close to what you're describing now, that it's not only the incarnation is not just the particular person, Jesus from Nazareth, but that God becomes part of the material world in a more broader, more cosmic sense. But is that, I'm wondering if that view, are you forced to become a panentheist only because you hold that kind of view of the incarnation? I'm not necessarily sure that's the case.
I would say it's more theopanism. God is in all things in an emanative sort of way, rather than the world is in God's womb or zimzum or space. So it's a different causal arrow.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Any other questions at the moment, or are people cogitating? In which case, I'm going to take chair's prerogative. I thought it was really interesting where you said about this descent from panentheism to pantheism. I don't know if you, this could be where you're like, that was the one thing I didn't want anyone to pick up on. It was a throwaway comment. But I wondered if you could, it almost felt like you were saying that panentheism is okay and we've got to be careful about descending to pantheism. I don't know if that was the case. I wondered if you could expand on that, or if you think pantheism is more problematic than panentheism, or yeah.
I do think that pantheism, in some senses, are more problematic when trying to relate it to science. It would seem like, if, at least to me, when I started investigating this, that they would be more compatible. Like, if the world is God and God is the world, what's the problem? Then there is no clash at all between science and religion, or science and pantheism. But I think there are some other issues relating to, for example, the idea of, okay, what is a proper idea of the divine as a creator, or as a eternal necessary being. And as far as I'm aware, modern cosmology cannot support the idea that the world is eternal. You can only look so far back to the Big Bang, but what lies sort of beyond that is, then again, we have left the domain of science and we're in the domain of metaphysics and philosophy. So yeah, so but fine tuning and so on. I think there are some issues with pantheism, but also if my comment there that if we don't want the theory to sort of implode or collapse into pantheism, the idea was more like, if we want to explore, is panentheism better than classical theism? We don't want this theory to implode into something else, because then we haven't really answered the first question, which of these two are more compatible. So
brilliant, thank you, really appreciate that. Mike, you're next. You're currently still on mute, Mike. Has anyone else got any questions whilst Mike is dealing with some technical? Yes, Gavin, thank you. And then we'll come back to Mike when he can get the mic. You're also on mute, Gavin.
I swore not to do that. I sometimes worry that panentheism is over scrupulous in its attempt not to contradict science, as if science was, I mean, I think most scientists will accept that there are metaphysical presuppositions underlying science, and one of them is, of course, the closure and so on, which limits science, if we will admit it, to only what it is capable of explaining, and that includes the regularities. The business of contradicting science, therefore, seems to be not so important. What Judeo-Christianity says, and I think that's more than classical theism. I like to think of classical theism as overly influenced by Plato, Neoplatonism, but Judeo-Christianity has a very strong concept of immanence and transcendence in total balance, and there's no merging or the line between them or anything like that. God is both transcendent and immanent, and is both infinite and personal, and therefore, like a friend, this is the analogy that I think is so seldom drawn, there will be habits which are gracious habits enabling us to do science, and there are breaking of the habits, and I don't even like the word breaking, because most of us don't call it that when we break our habits for a friend. We naturally do something different for a friend, and that's both divine action. No contradiction. And for me, maybe I'm being too simplistic, but panentheism seems to be moving back to Judeo-Christianity, which is wonderful, but hanging on too tightly to this burden of not contradicting science when it doesn't need to worry about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you're perhaps right, and if you agree with my conclusions, then panentheists and so can be more relaxed, and that like science engages with like empirical explanations, and that's fine, but that's not necessarily the whole picture. Yeah, you don't have to worry too much about is my conception of God consistent with science, because the conception of God entails a whole lot more than empirical explanations. Yeah.
Thank you. I was sorry to lose that last slide so quickly, because they were lovely conclusions, but I can't remember them properly. So, yeah.
Maybe I can.
Do you want to put it back up, Lina? Yeah,
put it back up.
Put it back up if you like. Yeah.
So maybe I should have added a fourth point here, like classical theism is consistent only with the methodological principle, but that's okay because we don't have to accept the ontological stronger version of the causal closure principle. Yes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lina, and thanks, Gavin, for the question. Has anyone else got a question? Another question for Lina?
I have now. I'm unmuted.
Brilliant.
Well, this comes from a historian rather than a philosopher, but I would first, Lina, like to compliment you on that presentation, because I thought it was a very shrewd and very penetrating analysis. So thank you very much for that. I stress coming as a historian to this question because what is wrong with the concept of an intervening God? And that question comes up. It's lurking there all the time. And my sense is that there is an aesthetic issue very much involved in which way one prefers to go in defending the notion of intervention and setting one's heart against it, and having to come up with some very sophisticated philosophical position in order to avoid conceding that you are talking about the fact that things are happening in the world that would not otherwise have happened had it not been for some kind of direct supernatural influence. And I just wonder whether that question, just shifting the terms of the analysis a bit towards aesthetic questions about why is it that some find it aesthetically satisfying to get rid of intervention and others seem to have no problem with it at all. So is there a dimension there that one ought also to be looking into?
Thank you for the question. I'm just gonna have to guess here why people or some people are drawn to that. And my guess would be that science has such a strong hold. It's like it's so authoritative in our societies, and it's so whatever science says is true. And if we're also a bit religious, some are drawn to, then I have to have a conception of God that fits with whatever natural science says because it's so authoritative. That would be my guess. But and also why some theologians are drawn to conceptualizing God as natural or naturalistic, and like be opposed to the supernatural as something, a word they don't even want to touch. So, but according to me, you don't have to be afraid of the supernatural. You could have a whole supernatural intervening God and still be totally into science. Like there's no clash or clinch according to my analysis. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it is just, I sometimes remember the intervention of colleagues at conferences on science and religion around the world who have tended to take the view that if you have any concession to the concept of intervention, you are simply making science impossible. And it's that very strong claim about the intervention of anything supernatural means that you are allowing for the possibility that anything could happen at any time, in which case science is just emasculated as a human kind of commitment or human enterprise. So there is no doubt that word intervention has carried a huge amount of weight in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess that some people also confuse, or they believe that science is sort of based on or necessarily the same as the philosophical position scientism, which like says that science can answer all questions. Science will eventually be the theory of everything. But that's not, I believe, the correct view of science. Science it's not a philosophy, it's a more like methodology or hypothesis, confined to empirical observations and so on. But that will not necessarily offer us the theory of everything.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of wisdom in that position, I think.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Lina. We've got Robert just wanted to pass on his thanks for the paper, and Mike's managed to get a question through in the chat, so I will just share that with you. So he says, firstly, thanks for your presentation. A couple of times you used the word supernatural, which has, of course, been examined recently by Peter Harrison. Do you think there are any senses in which supernatural is a helpful category when thinking about panentheism? Which I think you sort of touched on a bit, but yeah, maybe if you can expand.
If it's a helpful sort of category, especially when discussing panentheism.
Especially with panentheism, yeah.
That's a good question. I don't really know. Maybe it helps to sort of still hold on to the more part of God, the transcendent, the part of God that isn't the world. So maybe it would be helpful sort of not to implode into pantheism, like if we keep the supernatural and not only try to describe God or God's actions as natural or naturalistic and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions? Okay, I have one more. I kind of got the impression that like a lot of this and a lot of the kind of the whether panentheism is a better option than theism, for want of a better term, kind of the saving of theism almost rests on the importance of whether or not there is causal closure in the world. Do you think that there is still a role for or a place, or that panentheism is the more correct option if we're not dealing with this challenge of causal closure? So if you said actually the world is causally open, does that then take away the driver to turn to panentheism to explain the challenges such as God intervening? I don't know if I explained that very well.
Yeah, and I have an answer, but I'm not sure if I will answer your question. But I think that if we remove the whole idea that we need to have the ontological causal closure thing, and if we get rid of the idea that that we need that to have a conception of God coherent with or compatible with science. If we remove all that, then I think there are other reasons to favor or be into panentheism, but which has nothing at all to do with science. Like, if, for example, the idea of God as essentially loving, that's a theme I've also engaged with. There, I think there are some interesting reasons to prefer panentheism. But I mean, that has nothing to do with science. So no, if we get rid of all of those, the idea that, the authoritativeness of science, I would say there are a lot of other themes that we need to dig into, like the problem of evil, or how God can be loving, and so on, in order to conclude whether or not panentheism is better than some other conception of God.
Thank you. That actually gets to what I was badly trying to get towards. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you. We do have time for a couple more questions if anyone's got any. Andrew, go for it.
Do you think that Arthur Peacocke's form of panentheism is a causal joint theory? Or do you think it's more of a theistic naturalism, as Sarah Lane Ritchie would describe them? if you know what I'm referring to.
Could you briefly describe causal joint theory?
Well, the effort to find a position within the universe at which God acts, you know, like at the quantum level or through chaos, top-down causation, as opposed to, like Sarah Lane Ritchie in a book says, that forget about causal joints, just accept God is in all things, acting non-competitively across all levels of creation. So she says, let the world be causally closed. It still makes no difference to how God works. And she comes up with, you know, Thomistic double agency, or incarnational panentheism, or pneumatological panentheism, pneumatological agency. So I'm not quite sure where Arthur Peacocke fits in that. It seems to me he's more trying to find a loophole, a lacuna in which God can act, rather than these other more holistic views about God's action.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but I think I agree with your impression. But I mean, and he's also very clear that God is the creator, and there is a dualism, and some kind of ontological dualism, but the world is still part of God. So
Okay.
yeah, I don't have any better answer. I'm sorry.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lina. I think if we give Lina another round of applause, because I think she's handled half an hour of questioning really, really well. So thank you ever so much, Lina. Like I say, I think it's been the perfect place to start, and I think a lot of questions now going into the next sessions, I think will be carried over. So thank you ever so much for your paper. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.